for joining me today. This is our second to last week in Isaiah. We've been walking through Isaiah for this fall, and we have almost reached the end. Today we're going to be taking a look at Isaiah 58. Will you pray with me as we get started? God, I thank you so much for today and that we get to gather together and open your word. I pray that as we read your words and as we talk about it, God, and think about it and just ponder these words that were written down so long ago, God, I pray that you will speak to our hearts and that you will just continue to teach us and draw us further up and further into your presence, God. We love you and we pray all of this in your holy and precious name. Amen. So as I said, we are almost through with our study of Isaiah. It's what we've been doing for the whole fall, and it's been amazing as we've walked through, and we'll talk a little bit more about that next week. But today we're going to be focusing on Isaiah 58. So last week and the week before, we've been talking about the servant of the Lord who God was going to send to deliver the people from their sins, and how it was God's plan to rescue the people and redeem them and restore them by sending this servant who was going to deal with the problem of their sin and help them be restored to God. And we're going to build on that this week, and we're going to continue to talk about the people's sin. And that's where Isaiah goes here in chapter 58. And this is also going to be tied back a little bit to chapter 1, all the way back to the very beginning where we talked at the very beginning of this study. So I'm going to read all of Isaiah 58 and let's see what God has to say to us today. I'm going to be reading in the NIV. You can follow along in whatever translation you have. I also really liked the New Living Translation this week. So if you want to read it in a different version maybe than you're used to, I highly recommend that one as well. So Isaiah 58. Shout it aloud, do not hold back. Raise your voice like a trumpet. Declare to my people their rebellion, and to the descendants of Jacob their sins. For day after day they seek me out. They seem eager to know my ways, as if they were a nation that does what is right, and has not forsaken the commands of its God. They ask me for just decisions, and seem eager for God to come near them. Why have we fasted, they say, and you have not seen it? Why have we humbled ourselves and you have not noticed? Yet on the day of your fasting, you do as you please, and you exploit all your workers. Your fasting ends in quarreling and strife, and in striking each other with wicked fists. You cannot fast as you do today and expect your voice to be heard on high. Is this the kind of fast I have chosen? Only a day for people to humble themselves? Is it only for bowing one's head like a reed and for lying in sackcloth and ashes? Is that what you call a fast? A day acceptable to the Lord? Is not this the kind of fasting I have chosen? To loose the chains of injustice and untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free and break every yoke. Is it not to share your food with the hungry and to provide the poor wanderer with shelter? When you see the naked, to clothe them and not to turn away from your own flesh and blood? Then your light will break forth like the dawn, and your healing will quickly appear. Then your righteousness will go before you, and the glory of the Lord will be your rear guard. Then you will call, and the Lord will answer. You will cry for help, and he will say, Here am I. If you do away with the yoke of oppression, with the pointing finger and malicious talk, and if you spend yourselves in behalf of the hungry and satisfy the needs of the oppressed, then your light will rise in the darkness, and your night will become like the noonday. The Lord will guide you always. He will satisfy your needs in a sun-scorched land, and will strengthen your frame. You will be like a well-watered garden, like a spring whose waters never fail. Your people will rebuild the ancient ruins and will raise up the age-old foundations. You will be called repairer of broken walls, restorer of streets with dwellings. If you keep your feet from breaking the Sabbath and from doing as you please on my holy day, if you call the Sabbath a delight and the Lord's holy day honorable, and if you honor it by not going your own way and not doing as you please or speaking idle words, then you will find your joy in the Lord, And I will cause you to ride in triumph on the heights of the land, and to feast on the inheritance of your father Jacob, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. What a passage. As I said a minute ago, there are definitely echoes here of Isaiah 1, 10 through 20, and we're not going to read through that one. I do encourage you to look back and read it for yourself, though. Isaiah is calling out the people's sin. They were filling their lives with religious activities, but their hearts were far from God. They were fasting and denying themselves of food or denying themselves of other things, and just for the sake of doing that. And we see when we think about this that they were doing it more with the wrong motives, more from a motive of wanting to do certain things so that God would do things, so that God would act. And that would be what the religion of the Canaanites, the people of the land, that the people of Israel were not supposed to emulate. God had warned them countless times, don't do things the way that the people of the land do. But yet they did. So they were saying, oh, well, we're going to do X, Y, and Z thing so that it will put pressure on God to act. That is what the religion of the Canaanites did. And lots of ancient Near Eastern religions, and honestly, lots of religions all around the world, ancient religions specifically, are if I do A and I do B, then it will equal C, which is the gods are going to do something. And so that's what we see here, is that the people were fasting, but they weren't fasting to focus on how much they love God or in obedience to God. They were fasting to try to get God to do what they wanted. Saying they seem like they are devout, they seem like they're pious, but yet they're not. They're filling their lives with these religious activities and their hearts are not in the right place. They're still exploiting their workers and quarreling and beating each other and all of these other things that are mentioned in verses 3 and 4. And God is saying, that's not what I'm asking. That's not what God wants. God is not, we can't manipulate God into doing what we want just because we do the right things. That's not how it works. The religion of the Israelites is supposed to be a religion of response. They were supposed to respond in obedience to God, respond to God in faith because of who God is. Not in order to get God to do things or to receive some reward or to try to influence him in some way. They were supposed to be doing things out of obedience to God, of a faithful obedience, trusting that God was going to, that God wasn't going to do something, but he was God, and that was the reason they're supposed to be doing religious activities, to worship him. And it's such an interesting thing, because I think that, bargaining is something that we like to do as humans. I was just thinking about all the times I've traveled in other countries where striking a deal is the norm, especially like if you go into a grand market or a bazaar of some sort. It's expected that you're going to bargain. It's expected that they're going to tell you how much something costs, and you're going to come back with a lower cost, and you're going to go back and forth a little bit of time. But you better have already decided ahead of time what you're willing to pay for that item. Otherwise, you're just going to go back and forth forever. I definitely have had the experience of making a shop owner less than happy with my bargaining for some bracelets. I should have put one of them on. I have these 2 bracelets that I wanted in one of the times we were traveling abroad. And I had said, I want them both for this price. And I'd come up a little and the shop owner would come down barely any. And I just kind of stood my ground. And this particular shop owner eventually gave in, but not without slapping me really hard on the arm first. That So I'm still not really sure if, from a culture perspective, if maybe I stood my ground a little too much and I should have given a little bit more. But we all like a good deal, don't we? I don't recommend standing your ground with shop owners in other countries to the point where they get frustrated with you, though. I definitely don't recommend that experience, even though I do have my bracelets to show for it. But we like to strike a deal. And sometimes I think it can be easy for us to even fall into that way of thinking that if I just read my Bible enough, or if I just pray enough, or if I just fill in the blank with whatever religious activity that you want, if I just do that enough, maybe then God will be happy with me and things will go right. But that's not what it's about, is it? Following God and a relationship with God, it's just that. It's a relationship. When you think about a friend relationship or even a marriage relationship, that doesn't work if you're just cutting deals back and forth. Well, I'll do this for you and then you can do that for me. It's about doing things for the other person because we love them, not for what they could possibly do for us if we do the right things for them. And that's not a relationship. That's just a bargaining chip back and forth. And that's what God's saying. The people are trying to treat him like that. And he's saying, but that's not what this is about. Instead, and this is where we get down here in verse 5. So starting in verse 5, God talks about how instead it should be, starting in verse 6, not 5. Sorry, excuse me. So in verse 6, it's not supposed to just be denying themselves anything of all things just for the sake of getting God to do something. Instead, it should be denying oneself of extra food because you're going to feed it to the hungry, or choosing to help right injustice and release those who are oppressed and to provide shelter. So yeah, you may relinquish some space in your house to provide shelter to someone in need, or maybe you spend some of your money to help clothe or feed someone, or spend your time to help fight for causes of justice, maybe on the behalf of orphans, or you fill in the blank. This is what God's saying. He's saying we're not supposed to be denying ourselves just for trying to get him to do something. It's about being not being self-focused, but being others-focused. So I may go without a new pair of shoes because I'm going to spend that money on taking care of my neighbor instead. But if that makes sense, that's what I think that's what we're really going for here is that, and then at that point, that is when your righteousness will go before you, and the glory of the Lord will be your rear guard, and God, you'll call and God will answer. If we're just going through the motions and just doing religious activities, just to do religious activities, our hearts are not going to be drawn any closer to God. But if we are seeking after God and saying, God, I want to notice people the way that you do. I want to live for you. I want to serve you first and put you first before everything else. That's whenever we're going to start noticing change. We're not going to notice change in our lives without that, without putting God first, without letting disciple of Jesus be our true identity. We've been talking about that a lot on Sunday mornings and just around church in general, of how do we as followers of Jesus let that become the core of who we are. Well, I think it comes down to it whenever it impacts every aspect of our lives. When the fact that I am a follower of Jesus is how I identify first and foremost. It's not all the other things that make up who I am, but it is the core of who I am. And it impacts every other thing. You think about like the center of a wheel and you have all the spokes that go out. But that core, that center is disciple of Jesus, follower of Jesus. That's who I am. That's going to impact me as a mom or as a wife. It's going to impact me as a friend. It's going to impact me in all areas. As a coworker, as a daughter, all of those different areas of my life will be impacted by that. And that is the kind of faith, the kind of religion, the kind of fasting, to use the terms that are in this passage in Isaiah 58. That's what God's talking about here. It's what Isaiah is reminding the people. Hey, it's not about the religious activities. It's about where your heart is and who you're actually worshiping and why you're doing it. It's about your motives. And I think it's so interesting as we get through this passage and we keep going down further and we talk, and it ends with 13 and 14 talking about Sabbath. And at first glance, that seems a little different because we've been talking about fasting and about all of those different things. But then it comes down here in verse 13, it's like, if you keep your feet from breaking this Sabbath and doing as you please on my holy day, if you call the Sabbath a delight and the Lord's day honorable, and you honor it by not going your own way and not doing as you please or speaking idle words, then you will find your joy in the Lord. So the contrast for this false piety, this false religiosity, this false devotion to God is to joyfully keep the Sabbath. And when we think about the Sabbath, I'm sure that when I mention that, a whole host of different images or thoughts come to mind. But when we think about how the people of Israel were supposed to keep the Sabbath keeping is just a very different way of even living in time. To count our days where 6 days of work and then 1 day a week is completely focused on God, yes, but also saying, God, I trust you. That everything else throughout the week has been enough. I've done enough grocery shopping. I've done enough work. I've done enough housework. I've done enough of all of these other things. And God, I trust you enough to rest. God, I trust you enough to spend time in worship, to spend time doing things that fill me with life and to fill my family with life, that I'm going to trust you enough to rest and let my life be filled with things of you. And I think that that's such an interesting and poignant contrast to the false piety of this denying oneself just to try to get God to do something, but instead to say, I'm going to cease doing all of these other things that I've spent 6 days working for so that I can spend 1 day saying, God, it's all in your hands. I've done all I can and I'm trusting you. And to say that I am trusting God, like that I really am trusting him with that day and knowing that he will make my efforts the rest of the week enough and the money that I have enough, the food I have enough, that we can trust him with that. We see that rhythm built into the people of Israel just from the very beginning as he called them as a people and as he provided them food from heaven, manna from heaven. They were supposed to gather extra only on the 6th day, and there would be enough for the next day. It would still be fresh and usable. But if they tried to keep it over on any other day of the week, it would be rotten. But on that 7th day, the leftover would be enough. And so it's a way of saying, I trust you, God. And I'm living in time differently because I'm a follower of you, God. And I think that's why this is such a poignant contrast. This joy in trusting God, this joy in following him and letting him guide us and lead us and be so intimately involved in our lives that we can say, I trust you. Versus this constant activity and motion and focus on self that we see at the beginning. And I think as we come into a week, especially this coming week, with having a holiday week, and a lot of times this is the start of the holiday season, which is really busy. And even though it may look different this year because of COVID and all of the restrictions that we have to endure to keep people safe, I still think this is the time of year when things seem to ramp up and be really busy. But I encourage you to take time to slow down and to say, I trust you, God, and to let the work that you've done be enough, and to rest and to cease and rest in him, even in the midst of a potentially pretty busy week. So next week, we'll gather together again for one more time to talk about Isaiah. And I'm very excited about how we're going to wrap things up. I hope that this has been a meaningful study for you, and just encourage you to keep reading through Isaiah and keep just hearing what God has to say to us through these ancient words. All right, I'll see you next week. Bye.